to this Welcome to this online meeting of the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign. If you haven't been here before, welcome. And I'm assuming if you found your way here that you've already seen our online resources and our Facebook page, so I won't post them again. I just put, so Brad's presentation is going to be about 30 minutes. That's fairly long, but it's very detailed. It's a small group, so I think we can get away with that. Brad, I will give you a time notice at 20 minutes so that you can start wrapping up. Well, I think with this number of people, unless we have a few more people that show up, we can probably be very generous in the discussion. So we generally discourage people from putting things in the chat box. Much rather have you share them so that everybody can see them. It's also fairly distracting. So there's Stanley. Okay. Well, I don't know. What do you think? Should we give it a few more minutes or should we just get started? We should go. Okay, Brad, are you ready?
Sure.
Okay. I'm going to mute everybody if you're not muted. Go ahead, Brad.
Where's everything here? Hello, good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear my voice, and I hope you can see my screen share unblocked by strange visuals.
Yeah, we can see it. It looks good.
Okay, great. So my name is Bradley Mayer. My claim to having any knowledge of military affairs is essentially self-taught. I would say since the age of 7 years old, because I was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland as a child during the centennial of the Civil War, and that exposure got me interested in military questions. I would just simply describe myself, aside from having a typical engineering background and as well as training in metalworking, from steel mills to working as a machinist. All these things come together to make me what I would consider to be a organic military intellectual, if you want to call it that. But I'm not affiliated with any think tanks or anything like that. So let's get started. The basic questions to be the basic political questions behind this presentation of military matters is one, to address the question of whether NATO really plotted here some sort of proxy war since 2014 to force Russia into supposedly carrying out a supposed defensive war. That's the first one. And the second one is going to be, is NATO actually capable of supporting Ukraine, as it claims it does, to the extent that it would permit Ukraine to drive the Russian occupiers off of its territory? So keep those two questions in mind as I proceed with the presentation. In general, I think the Western media gives a fairly distorted view of what's going on, and I'm going to give examples of that as I progress with this. That doesn't mean that particular items in, say, the coverage of the New York Times are inaccurate or they're simply falsified, like as if they were talking about yellow cake. It means that laced in with true information is a lot of propaganda. And one of our purposes here is to learn how to filter the propaganda from what's true. And all of my sources, by the way, are Western sources. I have no pro-Russian sources in here. That has nothing to do with inaccuracy. It's simply to make my point. The first point to make is that Ukraine has always had a military industrial capacity that it inherited from Soviet times. And I'll get into that in more detail. But first, A quick high-level overview of the current situation. In the last week, there's increasingly less activity on the battlefront that you see here. There was apparently some Ukrainian drone strikes that were launched probably from here and hit Crimea somewhere. And this will give you an idea of the distance in which these drones had to travel in order to do so. And this is almost certainly retaliation for the massive series of Shahad so-called kamikaze drones that have been Russia has launched against Ukraine, and as you know, in the past couple weeks. So because of that, the Russians charged that the UK had some involvement in the Crimea drone attacks. Britain denies that, but who knows? Russia also suspended participation in a UN brokered grain deal with Ukraine. You might recall back in July, all the parties agreed to allow grain shipments from Odessa, which is right here, to go out through the Black Sea. This does not mean that Russia is going to block it, although they could militarily. It just means they've withdrawn from participating in the whatever body is overseeing that deal. Finally, there was, well, not finally, but thirdly, there was a second prisoner of war swap. More than 100 POWs released in prisoner swap between Russia and Ukraine. Okay, and otherwise, as you can see here, here's Kherson. As you can, according to this map, and I have to explain to you that this is now I have two of them up, but that this is what is called, excuse me here, but this is generated by something called Project Owl Community. It is, as it says here, is made up of various people who, from openly sourced, publicly available information, they filter this down and they come up with these situation maps as a result. So I can't vouch for their accuracy, but the reason I'm using them is because you can see place names. And also they have these cute little icons here indicating the location of combat units. So starting up here, this is the front that the Ukrainians made such big gains in the past period. So if you click on the Russian units, you'll see that they're all depleted according to this information. And I could go down here and show you that. I should point out that a single X, I should give you an idea of what the scaling here is. One thing to keep in mind is that Soviet scaling from battalion to regiment to brigade to division. So for example, up to corps and army. So this is 4X is an army unit. Okay, 2X's is a division. So 1X is a brigade. And I should point out that on the Ukrainian side, they don't really have divisions or corps, it seems. Brigade is the generic top level unit. And very often you see the same on the Russian side, brigades. Brigade level is the typical average frontline unit you'll see. Three vertical lines is a regiment, 2 vertical lines like that is a brigade. By the way, this is Special Combat Army Reserve, Russian Legion, who knows, could be. I do know that if you poke around here, one active battlefront supposedly has been in the area of, excuse me for all my moving around here, but I'm looking for Bakhmut. So you've heard about Bakhmut. Here's the Cossack. Here's the unit. Here's the Wagner group. And along this entire front, there appears to be only one brigade of Wagner mercenaries doing all the fighting here. Okay, all the quote unquote offensive fighting against several Ukrainian defenders. Since this is the only area of the front where the Russians claim to be making offensive operations, one can only conclude that in general, the Russians are avoiding sending in their, at this point, avoiding sending in their regular army units, as well as the Donbass, the various Sparta battalion and whatnot. These were in this area around Donetsk is where a lot of the Donbass forces are also concentrated. This whole area almost never moves. It's been very heavily entrenched since 2014. So not surprisingly, there's very little movement in this area. And like I said, in general, there's very little movement along the entire front at this point. Okay. This front, which is the one I'm very interested in, has seen very little movement. One thing to remember is that a lot of the lines that are formed along these transverse roadways. And the reason for this is that this allows for transverse movement of military supplies behind the front. So for example, as of late, the Ukrainians have claimed to have brought this particular road. I've heard a lot about this road from Svatove running all the way down to Kramina. They claim now, the Ukrainians, to have this entire road under their fire control, which means within the range of their artillery, so that Russians cannot use it laterally, I should say, to move up and down along the front. And that means behind their front, their lateral movement is slowed down. So that's the reason for claiming that. I should point out here, let me zoom out so I can find it. As we move down here at this town called Enerhodar, excuse my pronunciation, this is where that Zaporizhia nuclear power plant is located. Notice it's located across a large reservoir, artificial lake, that extends all the way down to Nova Kakhovka, which is where, and I'll zoom in here, this is where the dam is, and there's a roadway across here. This is interdicted by the Ukrainian long-range artillery, which could be HIMARS, or as we'll find out, could just as easily be Soviet design long-distance rocket artillery as well. But whatever the case may be, both these two bridges, this Antonivka bridge, as you know, quite some time ago was destroyed. I did see reports, including video imagery, that the Russians had established a barge that shuttles back and forth across here, parallel with that bridge. But of course, those can always be interdicted, and it's certainly the case that at both these points and anywhere in between, the Ukrainians have succeeded in not totally cutting off Russian supply, but slowing it down so that the Ukrainians can gain an artillery advantage, and simply the number of rounds that they can pump out in a day compared to what the Russians can do on the west bank of the Dnieper River. And I suspect, I've also been hearing reports that the Russian command is preparing entrenchments around Kherson. This city was a population 250,000 before the war. The Russians have claimed to have evacuated 70,000. I'm sure many other people left beforehand. So I don't know what the population is now, but my suspicion is that the Russians are going to turn this into some kind of, use the town itself as a fortification, fortified bridgehead on the west bank of the Dnieper River, even if they eventually evacuate the rest of the west bank of the Dnieper and withdraw their forces to the east bank. Notice that there are great sand fields or sand dune fields on the other side, not really good terrain for tanks. And in any case, if the Ukrainians, I'm sure the plan is the Russians will set up their artillery on the other side with screening forces and dare the Ukrainians to cross, in which case Ukraine will be in the same situation as the Russians are right now. They're also daring them. This is my prediction, so I could be wrong down the road. But if they withdraw to a much smaller area around Kherson, then they will be daring the Ukrainians to make a assault similar to what the Russians themselves did, as we all know, at the beginning of the war, here at Mariupol, okay, which was a somewhat larger city of about 400,000. So anyway,
Brad,
yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to let you know we're coming up on 15 minutes. I didn't know how
Okay,
much
so
time you
that's
wanted to
the
spend
end of
on
this.
the current.
So
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
So let's move on. Now, the New York Times yesterday, I think, is talking about how Western weapons are turning the tables in the artillery war. They basically say that where is it here? Excuse me. So they're basically saying that Ukraine is having to do with what they call homemade drones, which the Ukrainians are quite able to manufacturing themselves. They're not homemade, I'm sure, and use it to knock out Russian tanks. And basically what they're saying here is that, my apologies here, I'm trying to get to the, yeah, so the excerpts from this are that the tide has turned along the front lines, but actually they're only talking about the Kherson front line in the what I just showed you. New York Times tells us with powerful Western weapons and deadly homemade drones, Ukraine now has artillery superiority in the area for reasons that hopefully I just explained. Commanders, okay, cheap homemade drones, says the New York Times, as well as more advanced drones and other weapons provided by the United States and allies. They also mentioned that Ukraine strikes are not only longer range, but more precise because of the satellite guided rockets and artillery rounds provided by the West. In other words, the New York Times is claiming that a bunch of smart artillery rounds and smart rocket artillery is making all the difference. But as we learned from the US invasion of Iraq, the large majority of ordnance expended by artillery, whether rocket or howitzer, or dumb rounds. And this is true also of bombs dropped and rockets launched from the air by the United States. But the New York Times is giving you the idea, the misperception really, that everything supplied by NATO is a smart bomb and a smart rocket. It's simply not true. And in fact, what is really disguised here is, to move on to the next. Well, first of all, in the article, after saying all that, the second video image they give you is of a mysterious multi-rocket Grad launch system. Now, this is a Soviet design system. It's very common in Ukraine. It's a shorter range. It's not to be confused with HIMARS or the S-300, or not the S-300, sorry, or with the Smersh, which I'll tell you about later. It's the medium range rocket artillery unit, very common, designed way back in Soviet times. So let's move on. There's the photo of the same thing. Also, you will be told that the Ukrainian, actually this is Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is telling you, and I'll just run it here with the sound off. They have unleashed a Czech Vampire rocket system. Okay, this is a Western system, we're told, being supplied by NATO. But actually, it's a Czech modification of what I just showed you, of the Russian, or I should say the Soviet make and Soviet design Grad system. Okay, so I don't think we need to go on further with that. Here we also have by something called the Defense Post, Soviet area rocket launchers still serving on Ukraine front line as of September 23rd, 2022. Again, this is another Grad, medium range rocket artillery. So clearly the Ukrainians are using lots and lots of this. In the drone war, we've all heard about this. What tends to be suppressed again in the Western coverage, using the New York Times as a typical example, is that much of Ukraine's anti-air defense is supplied by, again, a Soviet design S-300s, which if I get time to do so, I can tell you about a bit. Using S-300s is a kind of a wasteful overkill to try to knock these things down. And these Sahads are a problem because you really can't shoot them down with rifles. What this article is saying here is that what Ukraine is trying to do is trying to use their own drone technology to fly drones up there and knock them out of the sky with you call them counter drones, if you will. And in general, I've heard, and to me, from right now, this has the status of a rumor, but one of the problems, the command and control problems that Russia had when it launched this invasion is that it had learned in its Syria intervention how to use drones for reconnaissance. The majority of drones used in combat are not weaponized. They have cameras, they're used for reconnaissance, and they're used for communication, and therefore they're important for command and control between units, between infantry units on the front line and the artillery supporting artillery behind them, so that the drone can tell the artillery where to fire its rounds. But what I've heard, but I can't verify, is that Ukraine, unlike in Syria, had the ability to knock out a lot of these Russian drones, and that may be one reason why they had so many command and control problems in their invasion. So, and in any case, I'm going to leave this running in the background. This is a captured Russian tank of Soviet design. I don't know if it's a T2, a T80, or a T90, but that's to set up my theme here, which is that there are 25,000 of these T-72s worldwide. A lot of them can be found in India. It turns out India, I've discovered, is the greatest non-Russian cache, if you will, of Soviet design, sometimes Russian make, imported, but very often now Indian make Soviet design weapons in the world, which raises an interesting question that I'll bring up later.
Brad, I just wanted to let you know, it's been 20 minutes, but I mean, I think I'm going to let you go past the 30 minutes. I just wanted you to be aware of that, though. It's been 20 minutes. Go ahead.
Right. So I'll just skip through all this stuff, through all this tanky stuff, except to mention one thing. Its competitor for all these T tanks, by the way, T-72 means the first one was manufactured in 1972. So it's a 50-year-old tank, which has been continuously updated over the decades, but is still very much in service today. Now, the T-72 tank requires, let's see here. So one little data point. T-72 tank can travel 600 kilometers on 1,000 liters of diesel fuel. The M1 Abrams tank has a 420 kilometer range on almost 2,000 liters of gasoline, not diesel. And that's important because that means this tank has quite a logistical tail, just with gasoline and fuel. And we'll get back to that a bit later. But these are the kinds of things that, here's a captured T-80 in the hands of the Ukrainians. What do we have here? So moving from the tanks to other captured Russian ordnance of, this thing was designed, the Metis M is is a pretty powerful anti-tank, infantry carried anti-tank tool, if you will. It was designed in like 1992, so it's slightly past the Soviet period, but it's still been around for like 3 decades and it's still very much in use. It's one of the annoying things about Zoom is there's the information on that. I can tell you that they're also capturing and supplying their National Guard with not only captured, but the MT-12 is again another 3 to 4 decade old Soviet design anti-tank gun to be towed around and used by infantry. And there's the information on that. And then I'll entertain you with something else, another point, which is Ukraine. This is my segue into Ukraine's own defense industry. You can watch that while I do so, explain to you that a report from the U.S. Congressional Research Services of the U.S. Congress, obviously, mentioned that Ukraine inherited a capable defense industry from the Soviet Union. That industry was capable of producing a range of military hardware and other related products such as tanks and armored vehicles, aircraft and ships, missiles, and communication systems. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, reports the FPRI, which is another Western think tank. In fact, at the collapse of the Soviet Union, its armed forces amounted to 780,000 troops, 6,500 tanks, 1,100 combat aircraft, and more than 500 ships. They also had 176 intercontinental ballistic missiles and over 1,000 tactical nuclear weapons, which they voluntarily gave away after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, as you know. Now, by 2013, Ukrainian military had, quote, downsized. It now only comprised 184,000 regular soldiers, about 700 tanks, 170 combat aircraft, and 22 warships. So why did that happen? Because up until 2014, to make a long story short, Ukraine took its enormous military industrial inheritance from the Soviet Union and basically squeezed and milked that for export revenue, this is why Ukraine was able to become one of the leading exporters of military hardware in direct competition with Russia, obviously, since it was all Soviet design hardware. But they did so by simply running down their military industrial complex, and no doubt the export revenue went in the hands of Ukrainian oligarchs. When the war started in 2014, Ukraine had to do a 180-degree change in this. By the way, I'm going to freeze that. This is the Kharkiv Morozov Machine Building Design Bureau, was a huge factory for repairing tanks. I don't know what its status is now. The Russians may have destroyed it. It's it's been there since 1927. No doubt, though, the Ukrainians have moved the means of production and skilled workers elsewhere to continue repairing armored vehicles. So just wanted to note that as well. Now, so after 2014, the Ukrainian military realized it had to stop, running down its military industrial complex, and they reversed, they stopped exporting, and they started rebuilding. And this homemade combat vehicle that this guy is going to talk about, which is called the BTR-4, I'm just kind of jumping forward past this stuff, is based upon the Soviet designed BTR. Now you'll see BTR and BMP. The BTRs have tires. The BMP is a tracked vehicle. The BMP has a cannon or some kind of rapid firing cannon on top, and it's designed to provide some sort of infantry support, firing either anti-tank missiles or something else. But the BTRs were designed by the Soviets to be a reconnaissance vehicle traveling with light infantry. The Ukrainians took the chassis and they put a different turret on it. They installed a lot of advanced electronics. They did it all themselves in their own factories. They tried exporting these before 2014. They tried exporting it to, oddly enough, Iraq. Iraq tried testing some of them and rejected it because there was a lot of defects and manufacturing defects that they found in it. After 2014, the Ukrainians then went back to the drawing board and fixed the defects, and now the thing works pretty good. And that's, you can, from the links, you can watch this in detail to get more of the details about this thing. It swims across water. Maybe they could storm across the Dnieper River with this, who knows? But it's a pretty impressive vehicle. The point being that Ukrainians are fully capable of manufacturing all sorts of their own military hardware. Okay. So I mentioned the Kharkiv armored plant, or what's left of it now. The other one to mention is the not this is, well, I'm going to move on here to their Air Force in any case, except that I can't because of Zoom. That's one thing I forgot about. There is in Lvov a state aircraft repair plant. Okay, it does helicopters, aircraft, UAVs, spacecraft, and basically everything.
So Brad, I just want to, it's been 30 minutes. I'm hoping you have 10 minutes. I'm hoping.
Yeah,
I know.
I'm probably going to need another 10 minutes here.
Yeah, okay.
I'm really going super fast through these.
I know, maybe you can do a part 2 another time.
If you'd like, I can certainly. I got to mention this though. Okay, I'll skip through
you got 10 more minutes. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I mentioned SMERSH. It sounds really ominous. What is SMERSH? Well, it's the Soviet design equivalent of the HIMARS. Okay, but it doesn't have the guided missiles. But here it is. It's all over the world. It has the same dumb rocket ranges as does HIMARS. No big deal. Guess what? Ukraine actually designed and made its own knockoff version of the SMERSH called the Vilkina. They manufactured about 100 of these. I don't know how many were left. One of the reasons to be interested in this question is probably I was trying to figure out how was it that the Ukrainians had to, in particular, be resupplied by HIMARS, and probably because a lot of these, what they had of their SMERSHs, probably quite a few of them got knocked out in the early stages of the war. I'll just leave you with this video in the background to entertain you while I continue to wrap up here. Now, since I have to wrap up, what I got to tell you here is that, as I mentioned, India, you can check my links, but they have huge stashes of ordnance. They manufacture their own T-90 version in India of the heavy tank. Not only that, but we learned that the UK, beginning in August 6th, has been flying from Romania or Cyprus to Pakistan's Nur-Khan Air Force, and for the purpose of loading up on more than 50,000 rounds of Soviet type artillery shells. So if they can do that with Pakistan, I understand why they can't do that with India. There's no war imminent between these two, or else Pakistan would not be selling their artillery so freely. I do have something to show you here. I want to show you this. I'm just going to show you this. You can look up this entire report on NATO, what NATO's actually sent versus what they have in stock. So in tanks, just real quick, 2% of NATO's stock has been sent to Ukraine of tanks, of howitzers, which are not the rocket launchers, but what look like normal artillery. They're kind of medium range artillery in the 155 meter range. NATO has sent 4% of their stock. Those are the M777s, for example. Of rocket launchers, the MLRSs, they've sent 5% of their stock. So they really haven't sent a whole lot of what they actually have, is the point here. Let's get that ad. So to wrap up, really, I'm going to wrap it up. So the Lockheed Martin, it's been discovered through the NATO think tanks that the United States has a ordnance supply problem. It does not produce enough ammo to keep up with Ukrainian usage. So that started with the javelins that are produced by Lockheed Martin. Lockheed says it's going to take 2 years to ramp up that production. So far, the Pentagon has not committed to supplying Ukraine with M1 Abrams. My suspicion is because, one, they don't want to see ugly propaganda pictures of blown up Abrams on the battlefield. That would be terrible. But also because of the logistics problem. Okay. It would be a huge logistical drain for Ukraine to support these. And I'm going to skip over the S-300s. Unfortunately, I'll have to talk about those later in another session. But the American Enterprise, let's see here. The American Enterprise Institute, hardly a liberal think tank, has a text that says, Earth to Defense Department, the military needs more rockets, missiles, and bombs as of September of this year. This mentions that comparing the Army's request for about 50,000 rounds of 155 millimeter howitzer shells in fiscal year 2019, which is an over 800% increase. The war in Ukraine alone has expended 800,000 of these same shells. These are NATO shells, so they're not going for the Russian ordnance I just showed you in just 6 months' time. And that's only fired from NATO howitzers. So the US military is not at all scaled up to produce enough shells to supply its own howitzers that it's sending to Ukraine. Nevertheless, NATO has set sights and had a plan to rebuild NATO's defense industry and shift it completely over to NATO ordnance in 10 years. But this is a report out of Politico, which says that NATO is right now developing a 10-year plan to do so. This is kind of a shift, changing horses in the middle of a stream problem to me. How is how is Ukraine, under a direct assault and occupation by Russia, going to at the same time shift over, dump all of its Soviet-make hardware, which makes up most of its arsenal right now, and shift completely over to a NATO plan in 10 years? Now, I'll end off with a report from another think tank in the UK called the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI. And it's titled, Industrial Warfare is Back, something to that. The Return of Industrial Warfare. This is dated June of this year. Here's just some choice quotes. In short, US annual artillery production would at best only last for 10 days to 2 weeks of combat in Ukraine. If the initial estimate of Russian shells fired is over by 50%, in other words, overestimated, it would only extend the artillery supplied for up to 3 weeks. In a recent war game involving US, UK, and French forces, UK forces exhausted its national stockpiles of critical ammunition after 8 days. The expenditure of cruise missiles and theatric ballistic missiles is just as massive. The Russians have fired between 1,000 and 2,000 missiles as of June. The US currently purchases about 600 to 700 missiles of the variety of Tomahawks and other type of missiles that I can't get into. Produces about 600 annually, meaning that in 3 months of combat, Russia has burned through 4 times the US annual missile production. Another quote, it is unlikely that the Russians are, they conclude it's unlikely, this is just their conclusion, I don't know, are worried about their stockpiles of missiles and ammo. In fact, they seem to have enough to expend operational level cruise missiles on tactical targets, which would be normally wasteful if they didn't have so many. The assumption that there are 4,000 cruise and ballistic missiles in the Russian inventory is not unreasonable. This production will probably increase despite Western sanctions, Rusi concludes. In April, ODK Saturn, which makes caliber missile motors, announced an additional 500 job openings in Russia. Now they got to find the workers for it. So flawed assumptions that Rusi concludes with. 1, that precision-guided weapons will reduce overall ammunition consumption by requiring only 1 round to destroy the target. That's really a false assumption. As I mentioned before, the large majority of ordnance expended is dumb bombs, dumb missiles, and dumb artillery shells, and will continue to be so. Also, and this gets to the capitalist part of it, that industry, military industry, can be turned off on and off at will. This mode of thinking was imported from the business sector and is spread throughout US government culture. This does not work for military purchases. Once the orders drop off, the manufacturer will close production lines to cut costs to stay in business. Generating new capacity is very challenging, especially as there is so little manufacturing capacity left in the US to draw skilled workers from. So the US does have a sharp skilled workers shortage. This is especially challenging because many older armament production systems, of the dumb kind that produce dumb bombs and missiles, are labor intensive to the point where they are practically built by hand, and it takes a long time to train a new workforce. The supply chain issues are also problematic because subcomponents may be produced by a subcontractor who can go out of business and so on and so forth, and you get the picture there. Finally, there's an assumption that overall ammunition consumption rates. The US government has always lowballed this number, says Rudy. From the Vietnam era to today, small arms plants have shrunk from 5 to 1 in the United States. This was glaring at the height of the Iraq War, when the US started to run low on small arms ammunition for rifles, causing the US government to buy British and Israeli ammunition during the initial stages of the war. At one point, the US had to dip into Vietnam and even Second World War ammo stockpiles of 50 caliber ammunition. This was largely the result of incorrect assumptions about how effective US troops would be. Indeed, the Government Accountability Office of the US had estimated it took 250,000 rounds to kill 1 Iraqi insurgent.
Brett,
luckily, yeah, I'm literally.
Okay, good. I want to make sure. Okay, go ahead. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, conclusion: the Russian onslaught consumes ammo at rates that massively exceed U.S. forecasts and ammunition production. This situation is especially critical because behind the Russian invasion stands the world's manufacturing capital, which, guess what, is China. So, therefore, Rusi then in other articles argues for some kind of peace deal between Ukraine and Russia that almost certainly would leave Russia in occupation of Ukrainian land. And hopefully you saw in my entertainment video here that all the complexity of logistics. So with that, I will conclude and open it up for questions. Thank you.
Okay. Brad, keep in mind that you will be able to come, hopefully, that you will be able to come back in at the end, if not before, to answer questions. We'll see how the discussion goes. So,
and by the way, sorry, so on that, others are invited to inject their own, political interpretations of this information, of course. I'm simply raising the questions here. So with that, go ahead.
okay. So you have to stop screen sharing.
Oh, I do.
Well, somebody does.
You're going to miss my clever animation of logistics.
Okay.
You can watch it on your own time. So.
Okay, good. All right. I hopefully will have time for a couple of rounds of questions and discussion. And if it makes sense, we'll have Brad come back maybe in the middle of that to respond. So I'm assuming everybody here knows how to use the raised hand function, although there's just a small number of people, so we could, I know I've got some questions. I don't see any hands. Okay, David, and I'm also going to call on Mudassar because he put some things that. Go ahead, David. You're muted. Yeah.
There we go.
Okay.
Can you hear me now? All right. So it was a very wide-ranging discussion. So just want to make a few general points. Like Brad, I also study the military aspects of what's going on in Ukraine. My interest started with the defeat of Iraq in 1992 during Desert Storm, when I thought the Iraqis would have stopped the United States. And I was wrong, and that got me interested in military stuff. So the great majority of small arms and rocket-propelled grenades and anti-tank rockets and man pads, which are used to shoot down helicopters and planes, against the Russians have by the great majority, like 75%, been of Ukrainian manufacture. The Western press likes to talk up, as do many vloggers, how grateful they are to the United States for the Stinger missiles, which is one of the better short-range anti-aircraft missile, handheld, over-the-shoulder kind of thing, and Javelin missiles. And it's simply not true. They do, United States and NATO does provide these things, but the great majority are the Ukrainian equivalents of all those weapons. And that even includes artillery rounds. One thing I just wanted to comment on, and I've talked a lot about online and other venues, is that an Excalibur 155 millimeter shell, which is about this big, that can pretty much pinpoint target, costs about $100,000 a shell. They don't use those to kill tanks with. They don't use those to hit troops, to kill troops. They're all the HIMARS as well, which costs $110,000 for one shot, which can travel further than the Excalibur, are used to hit bridges, to hit command and control centers, ammo dumps, and fuel dumps, primarily, and also airports and things like that. So they're of limited use, though they're very important use. They've helped the Ukrainians immensely, but maybe not decisively. And I think that's an important fact or opinion that needs to be discussed out in the world, about the use of specifically US provided weapons. The M77 howitzer has this exact same functionality as the equivalent produced by Ukraine or anybody else. There is no difference. The difference is that you can fly an M77, 777, under a helicopter, a Black Hawk, or you can put it on a AC-130 transport plane to fly it to where you need. It's very light, has a lot of aluminum and carbon fiber in it. That's the advantage of it. The real advantage the United States has provided Ukraine, and this is immense, is the intelligence of the satellite networks to be able to target logistic routes of the Russians. Been highly effective. I don't think the Ukrainians could come anywhere near on their own, though they do use drones for the same purpose. And also what's it called? The ability to aim your artillery, regular artillery. The United States makes one of the best in the world for sighting in artillery rounds. It's very quick. Combined with radar, you can counter when a shell comes in toward you. You can find where the Russian artillery is and take it out. And they don't even have that much of an equivalent. The Russians do, but it's not as much. And I think that's where the advantage of is the firing control systems that the United States provides. I mean, it's very specific and it's applicable to other systems as well. And just lastly, the Slovaks and Czechs and others have provided their own versions of tanks. There's a T-55 tank that Slovakia has provided. That's a 1960s era tank by the Russians, and the Czechs have put in new engines, new command and control, fire control systems, and new homogeneous iron steel armor. So all these stuff that Brad noted are coming from other countries like Poland are actually hybrid. They're not just taken out of the warehouse. Like the Russians are actually using T-34 tanks unupgraded in the war because they're so desperate for tanks. And they don't want to use their latest, greatest Armata tank because they only made about 20 of them. And there's all sorts of flaws with them. And my last point is this. One of the big problems coming out of this war for Russia was one of the largest arms dealers in the world, right behind the United States. China produces more and other countries might produce better stuff. But Russia is the biggest arms dealer for third world developing countries and warlords in the world. Well, the problem is their shit doesn't work as well. And it's been exposed to the Ukrainians' weaponry that have taken out all these tanks and armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles. And it's a problem for the Russia to recover after this war is over, to regain those markets. And one country that's going to do really well in the international capitalist arms market is Ukraine, because their shit really works well and better than the equivalent Russian stuff. So that's a small political economic takeaway from that. I'll stop.
All right. Mudassir, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
No problem, ma'am. Sir, it was a very excellent discussion, basically. So my question basically to you is that, I don't remember sir's name, that what are we going to do about the drone strikes which Iran is providing with Russia? What's the answer of Ukraine to that? Any native weaponry to defeat the Shahed 136 drone or something like that? And another point I want to say is, why isn't Ukraine not doing like a surgical strike type of thing, like going across the liberated territory to attack Russia from behind, so they will have less losses, right? Because Russia is waging a guerrilla warfare since 2014, and there's no progress in the east. So these are my questions. Hope you get my questions, though.
Yeah, Brad, you can come back in later.
What can I ask? I didn't catch Mudassir's second question. Could you repeat it, please?
No, sir. What I'm trying to say is basically, why can't Ukraine do a surgical strike? That means to say that going into the opponent's territory and attacking them, so that it pressurizes them to like kind of withdraw their troops, and why lose more lives in that bargain? That's what I want to say. Because they are waging a guerrilla warfare, right?
Okay. All right. Brad, I'm assuming you have that. If not, I've got it noted. I don't know what happened. Okay. Linda.
Yeah, I came here late. I thought the meeting was going to start at 11:30 like usual. One thing I got from what you said, and I think I've been hearing other discussions in other places. It's not really a debate going on out there, but there seems to be some question among different military people whether as to who's going to run out of ammunition first. And I'm not really, it's a complicated. I think it's a complicated question because Russia actually is going to start getting help from places like Iran, and they don't have the ability to produce because of the sanctions. They're having a lot of trouble producing, parts and ammunitions for their systems that they have now. And apparently, from what you just said, Brad, the U.S. is actually supplying systems for which they have inadequate ammunition, and they're not going to be able to ramp up production for quite a while. Is this going to be a factor? Is this something that people are talking about that you know of? And I'll stop here.
Call on myself. This is a really new topic for me. Just really absorbing a lot here today, and I appreciate, Brad, all the work that you've done and your lifelong interest in this topic. So you talked about India and how India has the largest, supply of some important weaponry. But unless I missed it, I don't think you talked about who's getting those in this moment. I mean, it wasn't clear to me if they're available, or I don't think that Ukraine, are they selling them to Ukraine, or what's happening with that? I'd like you to say a little bit more about that. I'm also confused about, obviously your presentation talked about how Western propaganda makes it sound like, well, without us, Ukraine would have no ability whatsoever to defend itself, which obviously isn't true. But if the midterm elections in this country go the way that they appear to be going, which is the Democrats will lose the slim majority they have, it's very likely that U.S. support for this war is going to change dramatically. I think that looks like it's going to happen. We don't know. But if you could say something about what will happen if the United States does pull out its support, that I'd be interested in that. I guess the last thing, which is less important because it's not really exactly, it is pertinent to your presentation, which is the question of soldiers and their morale versus weaponry. We know that Ukraine has the superiority in that department, but because there has to be people to operate weapons, unless they're drone operated weapons, and no one's going to be one with just that. So, okay, Ted.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl, and thank you, Brad. Thanks for other contributions too. I think we'd probably do 2 or 3 sessions about this topic and not exhaust it. So I want to say 2 things. Maybe Brad can expand in his remarks on first issue, which is Ukraine's capacity to produce aircraft. Ukraine had 3 aircraft and missiles. To my knowledge, and maybe more, Ukraine had 3 major military aircraft producers. The Kyiv Design Bureau, which built Neptune missiles, which took out the Russian ship, the Moskva, whose production was dispersed when the war began, so I don't think it was destroyed. The Motor Sich, the president of which was just arrested for espionage because Motor Sich, I believe, was located in Zaporizhia, makes aircraft motors, including especially for helicopters. They were still fucking selling them to the Russians. The Russian helicopters use Ukrainian-built engines. And also Antonov aircraft, based in Kyiv, which produced giant cargo planes. But all this capacity undoubtedly was attacked by the Russians, and undoubtedly some of it survived. I don't know the current situation. So this is adding information, but also asking a question, if you could add something to that, Brad. And last on the aircraft thing, before the war started, there were 23 companies manufacturing drones and things related to drones in Ukraine, mostly for industrial and agricultural uses, but 23. So they have a capacity to produce their own drones. Okay, that's one topic. Another thing that is not really part of Brad's presentation, but it's related to the first part about how before 2014, Ukrainian industrial capacity was degraded. And in my opinion, it wasn't just degraded for export reasons. It was degraded because the original strategy of the Putin regime to reintegrate Ukraine into Great Russia was not through military conquest. You know, Putin comes from the KGB, not from the military. They had a strategy of capturing Ukraine politically, especially through the Party of Regions and corruption. And they had many, many highly placed people in their payroll, like the guy who just got arrested, who was the head of Motor Sich, but many people. And they failed in that strategy. Revolution and Maidan and the action of people who were opposed to Russia, regardless of whatever else they're for, trashed the Russian political and intelligence strategy. So they moved to plan B or C, which is what they're doing now. But that is part of the reason I think their military capacity was degraded. And it's something to keep in mind because it hasn't all been removed. There are still these Russian agents, if you want to call them that, in Ukraine. Okay, I could say more, but I'll stop there.
Okay, since nobody else has their hand raised in this moment, Brad, why don't you come? Oh, I'm sorry, John. I apologize. Sorry, John. Go ahead. Can't hear you.
You muted.
Okay, there we go. Okay, I'd like to make a couple points on the current military situation, as I understand it. First of all, as far as the Wagner Group and trying to recapture Bakhmut, from what I've heard, it's more a political drive than anything else, in that Prigozhin, who's the head of the Wagner Group, wants to elevate himself politically within Russia. And what I've heard, Bakhmut serves no major military strategic purpose for Russia. The other thing, as far as Kherson is, from what I am understanding, what the strategy of Russia may be to completely take over the whole city in terms of having its troops in different houses and try to force Ukraine into a very costly house-to-house battle. And the possibility is that Ukraine could resort to the kind of siege that Russia resorted to in Mariupol. But the difference is that in Mariupol, the Ukrainian troops were highly motivated to hold out. And I'm not sure that the Russian troops are at all. Finally, I do think that the introduction of the HIMARS rockets, which incidentally are not long range, they're medium range, has been quite important in changing the military situation. But my main point is, that I think that we should look at the military, what Clausewitz said, I think it was him, who said that war is politics by other means. And you can see right down the line, for instance, why the United States so overestimated the military power of Russia, because evidently most of their intelligence was based on electronic surveillance, satellites, and so on, and they didn't have an estimate of the immense corruption, the effect that would have on the Russian military armaments and on the morale of the troops. So I think that was huge. Also, I think that another point is the extreme importance of logistics and mobility. And I think if you look at the map that Brad shows, and basically Ukraine exists within an arc, almost within a circle, but more within an arc. And Russia has to send its supplies from outside that arc, which means that they're much less mobile in terms of sending supplies from one area to another, whereas Ukraine can do it much more quickly. And so I think that is a real advantage. So those would be the main points that I would have, and I'd be very interested in hearing Bradley's comments on them.
Okay, Brad, that's a lot of questions. So Brad, you're screen sharing again. So why don't you go ahead and respond? Oh, Stanley just raised his hand. Hold on a second. No, let's.
Okay, so that's fine.
Yeah, go, Stanley.
Quick question. Chomsky makes a big deal about Ukraine, for all practical purposes, being a part of NATO. And in the run-up to the war, he says that Ukraine was a NATO enhanced opportunities partner. And others have said that Ukraine was flooded with US weapons or NATO weapons. So this is some of their story, and I wonder if there could be a comment about that. I'm done.
Okay, all right, Brad, go ahead.
Okay, to get off mute. Thank you for your questions and comments. I'll start from the top here. Use of US GPS and other, I didn't mention that at all. It's almost inevitable in this day and age that's whether you're using the US system or the Russian system or whatever, that's how things are going to be going. Clearly it was this was David Walter's intervention, by the way, which was very good on military details, and thank you for that addition, David. But yeah, so I didn't get into that. Clearly that has been of assistance to the Ukrainians, and it's pretty easy to supply as opposed to ammunition that you could actually fire and direct using your GPS. So there's a question about how to defeat the Shahad drone offensive. That is a difficult question. I mean, it's a difficult thing to do. I didn't mention or go into big detail about the S-300, which is the standard, again, Soviet designed anti-air system, which is probably on the average, the best in the world. The Patriots and others don't do much better than it. In fact, the United States clearly had to catch up in this area, and that's why they developed Patriot. However, using S-300 missiles to knock down these drones, which move slowly and are noisy, but are hard to detect in radar and hard to distinguish from a flock of birds. So it's actually quite wasteful to use S-300s to counter the Shahad drones. Also shooting at them with small arms from the ground, as we've seen in the media coverage, may knock them off course, but that just means they're going to crash and blow up somewhere else. So they really need to be intercepted up in the air and destroyed and exploded in the air. So as I mentioned, the Ukrainians are having difficulty with this. They are claiming, though, nevertheless, to shoot down about 70% of them. And I'm certain that the Russians expect that and are simply trying to saturate their air defenses as much as possible, planning on 30% of them getting through and doing their work. So they really need, in order to defeat the Russian Shahad drone offensive, they need to really knock down maybe 90%. They'd be able to knock down almost all of them so that the Russians realize they lose their effectiveness and will stop that tactic. So what I've heard, as I tried to mention in passing, is apparently the latest thing is the Ukrainians are working on putting up anti-drone drones that shoot them out of the sky and blow them up before they land anywhere. I don't know much more than that about how to defeat those, this drone offensive. There was a question, why can't Ukraine do surgical? Yeah. I think this refers to, it looks like Ukraine may have tried something like a surgical strike in the Crimean Peninsula with a drone. There are reports that, that there are Iranian personnel are actually active in Crimea, and possibly they were trying to knock them out. The ground support for launching these drones, in other words, which is another way to defeat them. So I don't know much more than that from this one episode, which of course the Russians hysterically went on about as a terrorist act and all this other nonsense. Some of the other questions here. Who is selling Soviet design weapons from? Now, this is one of the questions that I was looking to raise in my presentation. I didn't go into details about how much Soviet design weaponry is in possession of India, but I did detail that Pakistan is selling Russian artillery ordnance through the UK. So it's technically possible. And to tell you, and this is entirely speculative on my part, but why isn't the US, carrying out, it may be, but I've not heard anything about this, carrying out negotiations with India to do just that. Especially in exchange for looking the other way while India, the Modi government allowed the Indian refiners to buy up as much Russian oil out on the market as it could possibly get its hands on. So perhaps the Modi government is just as greedy about selling ordnance as just sitting around in warehouses for profit, without really being concerned about where it's going to. But if somebody can tap into India, they will have tapped into a huge source of weapons that can be supplied to Ukraine, given that it is largely dependent upon Soviet design weapons to carry out its struggle against the Russian invasion. And that's all the information I have on that. What David Walters did make a good point, which is that one of the reasons why you see a lot of Soviet design weaponry around the world, especially in the so-called global South, is because apparently the Soviets, and I don't know, I can't tell you about the current Russian capitalist state, what their policy was. They were fairly liberal with, licensing of production, and and so a so-called global South country who wanted to be able to produce and not be totally dependent upon Russia for its military supply, they saw this as an advantage for themselves. Certainly India did, as opposed to from the US NATO side. As far as I can tell, the M1 Abrams tank is manufactured solely and only in the United States. So if you want this tank, okay, not only do you have to deal with the logistic tail, but you are not going to be permitted to manufacture this tank in your own country. And I think that's true worldwide. And in general, as one would expect, the US is very, in its military industrial complex, are very tight-fisted about their intellectual property and prefer to have countries dependent upon the US for everything. The case in point, the leading case in point is Saudi Arabia right now, who can't operate its military without the US actively behind it. This is, to me, an argument against the 10-year plan that NATO is cooking up for Ukraine. So besides the fact 10 years will be too late. So that's all I got to say about Soviet design weapons, because that's all I know about it. There was a question about military morale. Clearly all these weapons and toys aside, military morale is essential, and it makes the essential difference, not weapons. It's really clear to me and to others that the Russian officer corps, to the extent that they even knew they were going to be part of an invasion, much less the GIs, the grunts, were not enthusiastic about it, don't really support this war, and it shows in their performance. So Ted mentioned, asked some questions or made some points about Ukraine's Soviet inherited military industrial capacity in the area of aircraft. This is the stuff I had to skip over for lack of time, but it's correct. Motorseek has been a private company. The oligarch has been arrested and charged with treason. It was probably one of the companies that made a lot of money before 2014, just selling aircraft engines overseas. And it's apparently continued to do that. The information I have on Motorseek was that Chinese investors were trying to buy a controlling interest in Motorseek through shell companies, and the United States intervened in it in a sort of inter-imperialist contest over this particular Ukrainian military industrial company. And that's all I know about that. But it seems like Motorseek probably needs to be renationalized if it hasn't already. There is a state conglomerate to which all of these companies, whether they're state-owned or private, connect to, which is called Ukroboronprom. And Ukroboronprom is where all these things end up. Ted mentioned the Lvov aircraft plant or missile plant that I briefly mentioned in my presentation. Again, I don't know the state of that, but apparently they're quite able to continue to produce drones, and they're continuing to fly MiG-29s. I didn't have time to show you that. I had a couple of things on Ukrainian modified MiG-29s. They have lots of those. So they're still flying in close combat missions when they can. Another thing is I haven't mentioned, because I also didn't have time to get into anti-air defense, is that both sides, my sense of it is that both sides are being very cautious and conservative with the deployment of fixed-wing aircraft. And that's because both sides primarily depend upon the S-300 anti-aircraft system, which is quite deadly to those. And both sides know this. And the Russian side has always been fairly cautious about flying its own air force in over Ukrainian airspace, and they do get shot down. And Ukrainians have been doing likewise. And the Russian answer to that has been to rely on cruise missiles, obviously, rather than its aircraft in the US style. Drones, there was a question about drones. Well, they may be making drones in their homes. They may be converting people's homes into drone factories, which can be done, and why not? But I suspect they're also still being manufactured out of Lvov. I think I would agree with, frankly, I don't know, but it sounds plausible what Ted's hypothesis about the strategy, the Russian strategy, the Putin regime strategy behind degrading Ukrainians' military industries, that it wasn't simply motivated by economics prior to 2014. Then after Maidan and the political revolution, then which installed a different capitalist government and regime. The Ukrainians themselves saw that they had to change this, and they had to take control over their own military industry and start orienting towards their own defense. And that BTR-4 that I showed you a video of, I recommend you see the whole video, because it's a case in point on precisely this point. The BTR-4 was a Ukrainian modification of the Soviet BTR that was made before 2014. And it was being made for export. They thought, we're going to come up with this. They didn't see coming up with this more advanced BTR with modern electronics and with a more powerful turret, firing a more powerful gun as something that they were developing for their own self-defense, but they were developing it as a bell and whistle to sell abroad as an advanced weapon. And when they did try to sell, first of all, to post-invasion Iraq, which, by the way, supposedly has an order out on 2,000 T-72s, by the way. Even though the US invaded it and occupied it and regime changed it, they're still buying, Soviet-designed T-72s. But they were also interested in this Ukrainian, and they put it through some trial runs, some proof of concept runs, and they rejected it because they discovered manufacturing flaws. And that video shows you what the manufacturing flaws were. And I think one other country, I can't recall, somewhere in the Middle East, was also a prospective buyer, and they also rejected it prior to 2014 for manufacturing flaws. So the Ukrainians after 2014 went back and fixed all of those design flaws for the purposes of deploying it in their own self-defense. And in fact, that video claims that BTR-4 is good enough so that if one of them actually was captured by the Russian military turns around and uses it for their own purposes. So the Russians think it is a useful weapon, and that is to the credit of the Ukrainian ability to design and manufacture their own military hardware. So I think that's the BTR-4, in other words, is a good example of the effects of the corruption of their military industry and the changes that were made after 2014. So do I still have time here? Or?
Well, the thing is, so Brad, what I'd like to do is I'd like to give anybody else who didn't speak or ask a question yet to get a chance to do that.
Okay, I'll do that, but I'll just to say that
Okay.
I'm up to John's question, so I'll hold off.
Okay, go ahead. I'll run.
Okay, yeah, so probably you're right, John, that the whole, since Bakhmut is the only thing the Russian side is advertising as a quote unquote offensive operation along that whole line, and since it's involving not a regular Russian military force, but a gang of mercenaries working for Russia, it likely is a kind of political stunt being pulled off by the owners of the Wagner Group. I wouldn't have any problems with imagining that is otherwise. What it indicates to me is that the Russian side is holding off on forward deployment of their new conscripts. They're really holding back from fully engaging with the Ukrainian military at this point. No doubt, in order to regroup and go through their command structure and sort out all the issues that they ran into in the initial invasion. Kherson, well, I suspect if the Ukrainians have any, I'm not an advisor to anybody here, Ukraine or NATO or Russia or whoever, but if they do what I speculate they will do, which is withdraw from the Western Bank except around the fortified city of Kherson, the Ukrainians would be smart just to seal that off and not engage in a direct assault, which clearly the Russians would love to have them do for propaganda purposes. See the bad Ukrainians assaulting their own cities. But militarily speaking, it's not really necessary, because the problem the Ukrainians have is, how are they going to sustain a crossing to the west side, not the west side, the east side of the Dnieper River? And if you recall the map I showed, the best way to do that is not from the lower Dnieper River in Kherson Oblast, but from Zaporizhia, which is actually the closest route to that nuclear power plant that I showed you. If you just look at my map and you'll see. But more importantly, from my point of view, that whole stretch of territory from the bend of the Dnieper River south of Zaporizhia all the way out to the Donbass front that was established in 2014, it's a front that moves, left to right. It's pretty wide open, but there's been very little military conflict that's pushed that line around since the invasion. To me, that's like an obvious place for the Ukrainians to launch a counteroffensive that would split the Russian line in two, especially since if you follow some of the NATO-oriented think tank reports, like I think ISW is the neocon one. It's certainly laced with propaganda, but their maps always show. Do you mind if I actually put up the map? Because it would help to understand what I'm talking about. Not here. So what I'm talking about is this whole stretch. Here is Mariupol, but the ISW maps somewhere between Melitopol and Berdyansk always show this kind of blob here that is called partisan. Now, I haven't actually heard of reports of actual partisan activity from here, but if it's true, then behind the Russian front, there are Ukrainian partisans scattered around here over a significant territory. So it seems clear to me, here's the nuclear power plant again. Any kind of breakthrough in this area that could drive toward Melitopol would divide the Russian forces, link up with the supposed partisans, and open a path around here to the nuclear power plant. So this is the area I've been waiting for. I'm not surprised that it hasn't happened yet, and that Ukrainians appear to do just the opposite, which is to put pressure on the far flanks of the entire battle line, thus up here at Kyiv and down here. To me, it makes sense to do so, operational sense, because it means the Russians have to shift reserves between the furthest points on their front, and also it shifts reserves away from this area, which seems to have the lightest concentration of force on the Russian front, Russian side of the front. So that's what I think about that. HIMARS, certainly, as I speculated in my presentation, from the Wikipedias and other materials I read, they estimate that at the beginning of the war, the Ukrainians had about 100 of these long-range rocket-launching artillery. And David Walters is correct. They are used for interdiction, for hitting way behind the lines at ammo dumps at command headquarters. And whether they're HIMARS or SMERSHs, they can also be used to interdict the bridges across the Dnieper River, and were almost certainly used for that purpose. So because HIMARS were one of the earliest heavy weapons, so-called, that were supplied by the United States, I conclude that this was probably the one area of lack that the Ukrainians had on their side. That indicates that probably out of approximately 100 of the SMERSHs, including their own manufactured version of the SMERSH that I showed you, probably quite a few of those were destroyed early in the Russian invasion with missiles, whatever. And so Ukraine had to make up for that by putting in an order of HIMARS. Okay. And that's what I have to say about HIMARS. The same was probably also true. The one area the U.S. cannot, decisively supply at this point, I think, is for air defense. but it doesn't need to at this point. The other area that appeared to be a weak link in the Ukrainian military situation were the towed howitzers, which which don't launch rockets. A howitzer looks like your traditional artillery piece, which I didn't have a chance to show you here, as opposed to a rocket launcher. But apparently Ukraine needed a supply of those from NATO as well. So they probably had a shortage in those two areas. They probably had a historical lack of the ability to quickly produce those things themselves, and therefore had to depend upon NATO to fill in the gaps in their artillery. I've also heard, as far as CIA, I've heard that CIA was completely flat-footed on intelligence on Russian capabilities. I'm not surprised, but apparently, you got to keep in mind that the United States has different intelligence arms. The Pentagon has its own defense intelligence agency, and supposedly they somehow got hold of or knew about what the Russian operational plans were for the invasion. So they predicted the invasion, and they at the time could give timely, up-to-date reports. So it looks like the DIA, as opposed to the CIA, does have better intelligence on actual Russian military capabilities, both before and during, up until now, during this war and up until now, and probably in the future. And as I pointed out from the beginning, one of the purposes, one of the questions or one of the claims by our political opponents on the left, one of the purposes of my presentation was to debunk and refute, to give us the materials to debunk and refute the claim that somehow NATO, in all of its evil wisdom and genius, plotted, at least from 2014, they plotted to take over the Ukrainian government and then drive Ukraine along as a tool in some sort of proxy war to provoke Russia into a necessary defensive invasion of Ukraine. The evidence I'm showing here would show that if you believe in that thesis, then you believe that Ukraine has done it, not Ukraine, but that NATO has done a pretty crappy job of preparing its proxy war. I think in reality, the truth is that the NATO powers, including the United States, were not prepared to wage a proxy war. And the evidence is especially plain in the problems, really a crisis, if they don't ramp up, if they're not able to ramp up their own military production, the NATO crisis in the supply of ammunition of all sorts. What kind of proxy warrior would you be if you failed to do that? Not a very good one. So that purpose is to arm us against these people, to wage our own direct war political war against them. It also includes claims made by someone who attended, I forget his name, but he was belonged to some sort of political sect who claimed that NATO was already in there on the ground in Ukraine, which I'm sure they have trainers and advisors on the ground. But for political purposes, what counts politically as a direct NATO intervention that would convert this into an inter-imperialist war would be thousands of US GI body bags coming home to the United States. So to that claim, I respond, show me the body bags. We're not seeing reports of that. At most, you're seeing reports of people who volunteered on their own from some Western country being killed or captured in Ukraine. Okay, so I'll stop there.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Brett. We will definitely consider having another meeting on this topic in the future, because it's, as Ted said, we could, there's a lot to cover. I want to just welcome Eric and Kieran to the meeting and ask you if there's anybody who hasn't spoken yet, which is Rick and Brian and Constanza, and you all know who you are. Would you like to speak or ask any questions? I think we're going to wrap this up in the next 10 to 20 minutes. I'd like to make a couple of announcements before we depart as well. Okay. So just the bit.ly link for all of the resources that Brad used in his research was posted in the chat, but it will also be on our link tree and posted. Oh, Brian, I didn't see your hand. Go ahead. Brian.
Yeah, I
He's
just have
muted.
an
Oh, there we go.
announcement later on when we get to that.
Oh, you have an announcement you want to make?
Yeah, later on.
Oh, okay, all right. Okay, so yeah, as I was saying that the resources that Brad used is in a shareable Google document that will be available on our various social media sites. We don't have any public meetings planned in this moment, but we will have soon on the calendar. And some of the topics that we've been discussing having public meetings on are the complex relationship between Ukraine, Israel, and Palestine, the role of China in this war and globally. There's other topics if other people want to announce them. I don't have them right here in front of me now. We are, of course, always open to suggestions for topics for public meetings. Someone just raised their hand. Oh, Simon just raised his hand. Simon, go ahead.
Just an announcement, actually, again, because you're talking about the public meetings. So I just want to, guys, to let you know that we're going to have quite a lot of meetings made by the European network. So maybe we can together make a schedule of the meetings at some point, because it would be good to, not to make them at the same date and make it more visible. We can advertise your meetings and that's not a problem for us. So just a schedule for the future, maybe that's just the idea for that, and that's all I.
Okay. Brian, why don't you go ahead and make your announcement?
Okay. Earlier on the Google list, I put a gaggle, I should say. I put a link to a recent radio program here that comes out of Case Western Reserve University that had to do with the war crimes that are being committed by the Russians in Ukraine. And there were 5 different people involved in the discussion. And some of them had been involved in convicting other people of war crimes internationally. This is, of course, the protocol that the US nor the Russians actually participate in. But what I thought was worthwhile was just that it does poke a lot of holes in all the pro Putin arguments about the war itself that are raised by Code Pink and other apologists. So I don't know if those folks would ever be interested in participating in a workshop, or I should say, a meeting. I do think that the show itself, and I can provide the link in the chat, would be worthwhile to add to our resource list, because it would certainly allow people to listen. And it's good. It's a good conversation. It's not boring or anything. It's about 50 minutes long. It's an hour-long radio show. I think that it'd be worthwhile just in the sense that it supports a lot of our position. And also it's kind of like, okay, so people talk about what the resolution is. Well, here's really an honest assessment of what the resolution is, that the Russians are conducting ethnic cleansing, and just as it was in former Yugoslavia, just as it was in Central Africa, there are means to bring them back to justice.
Okay, yeah, that's sounds really interesting, Brian. We definitely next Sunday we will be having a business meeting, so we should put that on the agenda for sure. Stanley and then Brad.
Sorry about that. I just wanted to mention that one of the biggest events of this last week was that the liberal campus had a huge effort, and they actually got 30 members of Congress to take their position and submit it in a letter, basically saying that instead of just supplying weapons, Congress should go over the heads of the Ukrainians and talk directly to Putin, that the president should do that. And they were annihilated, to use the term of The Intercept. I wrote about it and I put that in the chat. That's good, but Biden's position has to be criticized from the left, and I put that in there too. Maybe we can discuss that next week.
Brad, go ahead.
Yeah, on that note, assuming that we're going to wrap up here pretty soon, I wanted to make the political point about my conclusion from all this information is that it's almost inevitable that the US/NATO is going to require that Ukraine make some kind of truce or so-called peace deal that leaves Russia in occupation of substantial Ukrainian lands. If things are frozen where they are at now. One reason, I think Stanley just gave one data point, which is the behavior of the so-called progressives in the Congress. We're also hearing noises from the radicalized right, which is going to be controlling the House shortly. And my estimation is that they will find those pressure points. Their practice is to hold up budget items to extort things that they want. It's not that they're ideologically for or against supplying Ukraine with weaponry. They may be for it, but they know that the Biden administration is especially anxious to keep the supply going in their minds. And that they know is something that the Biden administration won't want to trade away. It's an effort to get the Biden administration to trade away other things that don't involve the military industrial complex, like who knows, Social Security, whatever. But the surface political effect is to create not only on amongst the progressives, but on the within the right, a apparently America First appearing Trumpy type caucus, much more substantial than the progressives in the US House. And that is the political disturbances that are going to come out of that are going to wreak political and economic havoc with the US budget. So I can't see, given the increasing, and what I predict and forecast it to be, is already a fairly sharp political crisis, especially in the United States, that political crisis is going to grow. So anybody out there who is in the position of Ukraine, who's thinking about a long-term 10-year plan for support from the United States might want to think again. So this is to conclude that the other purpose was to arm ourselves with in advance with preparations for the so-called preordained sellout by the US of the Ukrainian struggle for its own existence. That's it.
Okay. Stanley, is your hand raised again? No. Okay. All right. So just a couple of last minute things. So this meeting was recorded, and the recording will be available on our YouTube channel, which you can find by just searching in YouTube for Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign, as are all of our other public meetings that you can view there, along with, in most cases, the text if you want to read it instead. I put a post in the chat that if you are I don't know how everyone finds our meetings, but if you're interested in getting emails just for public events, please send an email to the campaign's Gmail address, which I put in the chat. And Stanley just posted that the letter that we wrote, that we responded to the ILW letters, the ILWU horrible letter about Ukraine, is on our Facebook page. We'll also put that some other places. So I think with that, we have weekly meetings on Sunday mornings, which everybody is welcome to join. But you have to let us know that you're interested. So any other last comments? I don't think so. Okay. Again, thanks very much, Brad.